Hey guys, so today we are going to begin discussing a concept known as nationalism. Nationalism is a movement that happens at the end of the Napoleonic era, and it's really all about this idea that this belief that people who share a common culture and history and traditions should feel a strong sense of loyalty to each other and have the right to govern themselves. Prior to the 1700s, most people in Europe were loyal to kings or empires, but after the French Revolution really shifted this idea that loyalty should be towards people instead. So as individuals began to see themselves as part of a nation rather than just as subjects to a ruler, they started to demand independence and self-rule. So this idea goes on to reshape Europe in the 1800s, uniting countries while also weakening large empires. So let's see how we got there. So we start, as always, with Napoleon. So right after the defeat of the Napoleon, Europe had been in near constant war for over 20 years, and the leaders of these countries are desperate to restore order. So after the downfall, all of these European leaders meet in Vienna, which is in Austria, between 1814 and 1815. They are led by the Prime Minister of Austria at the time, a guy named Clemens von Metternich, who is this handsome man right here. And what these guys really want is to restore order and conservative values back to Europe. So the goals of these are really all about going back to the way things were before the French Revolution. So the first thing is preventing French aggression. Leaders fear that there is going to be a spread of these democratic ideas from the French Revolution. People are unhappy with what happened to Napoleon, and so they really want to make sure France cannot come back from that. The way they're going to do that is by restoring the balance of power. No one country should dominate Europe again the way France did. No country is going to be a threat to any other country. In order to do this, they're going to have to redraw the borders of European nations, which is going to ultimately make some people pretty unhappy. Last but not least, they want to restore the royal families to the thrones of Europe, reinstate those kings and queens who had been removed. So Napoleon had put, his family members on the thrones of different European nations. We're going to get those royal families back on the thrones and make sure that we can go back to the old monarchies. The result of this is there are 5 great European powers that come out. Great Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. And this is known as the Concert of Europe. And as a result, the goal here is a system to maintain peace. Like I said, borders are redrawn in order to, contain France a little bit, giving them stronger neighbors like Prussia. However, France is not harshly punished. This is an attempt to turn back the clock. However, it ultimately failed because it ignores people's desire for self-rule, and the unintentional side effect is that it encourages nationalism and social unrest by grouping different ethnic groups together who are going to try to fight for their independence. So just to kind of give us a little glimpse here, this is a map of Napoleon's empire in 1815. As you can see, most of it is controlled by France and Napoleon or allies of them. Afterwards, we see a completely different France with these 5 great powers, this concert of Europe now being the ones in charge. Again, that is Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And keep in mind, this is a France under the new monarchy. So we're back to the monarchy in France. So we keep talking about nationalism. What do I mean by this? And obviously the root from nationalism is the word nation. And I think when we think of a nation today, we think of it like the same thing as these old empires and countries that we've been talking about, but that's really not true. So nationalism is the belief that people should be loyal to a nation, not a king or a government. A nation is a group of people who share a common culture and history. So rather than the government being based on who is king or emperor, it should be based on the same people who are identifying like you, right? And so what is those things that bring us together? Things like ethnicity, culture, language, history, religion, territory. All of these things should come together in order to create a nation state. So a nation state is when political boundaries and cultural boundaries are the same. A group with a shared identity within their own borders. So England, they have a common English history. They speak English. They have a religion, the Church of England. All of these things come together to make England. France, Ireland, America, Japan, versus someplace like Austria, which is not a nation state. There are many ethnic groups within that. So nation states are the goal of the nationalist movements. In theory, they want to create stability and reduce internal conflict. And this kind of becomes the dominant global model. Even to today, this is what we think of when we think of a nation. So first thing we got to talk about are the belief systems that are the core of these nationalist revolutions. And so there's three main belief systems: the conservatives, the liberals, and the radicals. So first of all, you have to remember that these are not the same as today's conservative, liberals, and radicals. Keep that in mind. So the conservatives are the wealthy and noble class. They want to preserve tradition and stability. They are arguing for a traditional monarchy. They believe in a strong social hierarchy, that classes should exist, and oppose rapid change and revolution. They value order, religion, tradition. They want to keep things the way they are or return to the way they were. This is the Congress of Vienna, right? Next is the liberals. Liberals are mostly going to come from the middle class. They want to promote freedom and individual rights. However, when they talk about a limited government, what they really mean is limited to landowners and the educated classes. They believe in constitution and rule of law. They believe in power to elected parliaments rather than monarchies, and they want elected representatives. However, only wealthy men can vote. They're not supporting full democracy. They want freedom and a say in government, but they want it to support middle class interests. Last but not least, we have the radicals. The radicals are from the fringes of society, often from students. We see students play a huge role, like university students play a huge role in a lot of these revolutions. They demand major, immediate change. They support extended democracy for all people. Everyone should be voting. They want to eliminate monarchies for good. They believe in equality for all citizens and social reform. And they are willing to use drastic changes, revolution, to achieve these changes. They want big changes. They want them right away, even if it means violence. And they are often the ones who are sparking many of these uprisings throughout Europe. So in order to kind of give us an example of this, I want you to pay close attention to this video. So this comes from the musical Les Mis, or Les Miserables. And this video will give you a good picture of the unrest that was in France in the year 1832. So the things I want you to listen out for: what are the nationalist ideals? When do they talk about France and what it means to be French? What are the class divisions? Where do we see social classes dividing and the problems between those social classes, as well as the complaints that the French people have and how they are trying to change France? So let's give it a listen and see what we see.
To scratch. This is from school, my high society. Here in the slums of San Michelle, we live on crumbs or run for piety. Tap on the teeth for what they yell. Think you're poor, think you're free. Follow me, follow me. Look down and show some mercy if you can. Look down, look down. Wake up, Ross! There was a time we killed the king. we tried to change the world too fast. Now we have got another king. He is no better than the last. This is the land that fought for liberty. Now when we fight for bread. Here is the thing about equality. Everyone's equal when they're dead. Take your place, take your chance. Vive la France! Vive la France!
Vive la France! Some mercy if you can. Look down upon your fellow man. When's this gonna end? When we gonna live? Something's gonna happen now. Something's gonna give. It'll come. It'll come. It'll come. It'll come. It'll come. Where are the leaders of the land? Where is the king who runs this show? Only one man, General Lamarck, speaks for the people here below. Lamarck is ill and fading fast. Won't last a week out, so they say. With all the anger in the land, how long before the judgment day? Before we cut the fat ones down to size. Hand to the king! Liberty for France! Before the barricades
So what did we notice? So you probably noticed there was a very clear distinction between the working class and the upper classes. So France has kind of gone back to this very big divide between social classes, partly based on industrialization. I love this line that the kid does where he says, you know, we were the land that fought for liberty. Now when we fight for bread. You know, we were the land that killed the king and we tried to change the world too fast. And we really see these nationalist ideas really start to take hold in France. And so use this as the basis for when we get into talking about these revolutions. These are the problems that Europe is facing at this time. Okay, so as we are seeing all of this unrest and new nationalist ideas coming into effect, they are eventually going to break out into a series of revolutions, which are completely going to reformat Europe. So let's take a look. So we start in the Ottoman Empire in 1821. So the Ottomans control the Balkan region, which is this southeastern part of Europe right here. And part of this region is Greece. So Greece has been under the control of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. However, they maintain a very strong cultural identity with the Greek language, their history and culture, Orthodox Christianity. And as these revolutions have already started happening throughout Europe, like the American and French and Haitian revolutions, there is a rise for independence of nationalism, rise of nationalism and desire for independence and resentment of Ottoman rule, sparked by heavy taxation. So with the support of many of the Greek elites and some secret societies, revolt breaks out in 1821. There's brutal fighting on both sides, massacres of both groups, and initially the Greeks are really struggling against these Ottoman forces. However, the rebellion is pretty popular with many people throughout Europe. The Russians hate the Ottomans. Other Europeans really have sympathy for Greek culture, especially scholars, and there is a movement for these countries to ally with Greece. And so the British, the French, and the Russians ally with Greece, and in a decisive moment during a naval victory, they managed to crush the Turks, and the Greeks win their independence in 1830. This is one of the first successful nationalist revolutions, showing the importance of foreign intervention and really inspires the other nationalist movements to come. And now Greece is back again to its own country. So this moves us into the 1830s. So in 1830, after the Congress of Vienna, Belgium was merged with the Netherlands, creating what's called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. However, there were some really significant differences between Belgium and the rest of the Netherlands. So Belgium is predominantly Catholic. Most of the Netherlands are Protestant. The Belgians speak a different language. They speak French. The rest of the Netherlands mostly speak Dutch. There is also some economic inequality. Belgium is more industrial, but politically weaker. And so in 1830, riots break out in Brussels, which quickly turns into a nationalist revolution, and the Belgians declare independence. While major powers do not intervene to stop it, the French and the British do actually support Belgian independence. And by 1831, Belgium becomes an independent kingdom, making this another successful revolution. And it was allowed to happen. Even though they didn't intervene in the way they did in Greece, they allowed it to happen. Now we see something different happen in Poland. So Poland had been partitioned and controlled by the Russian Empire. However, the Poles had a very strong national identity despite losing their state. And they had some major anger at Russian control and their lack of autonomy. And so after Belgium, they were like, hey, we can do this too. And they had a desire to restore an independent Poland. However, unlike in Belgium, the Poles do not have support from the rest of Europe because Russia doesn't want to let them go and they don't want to make Russia mad. Polish army officers and students launch a revolt in 1830. After some initial successes, ultimately Russia comes in and crushes the rebellion due to lack of strong leadership and coordination for the Poles. And this leads to some very increased repression where the Russians tighten control over Poland and Polish culture is significantly restricted, showing the strength of these powerful empires. Now, nationalism wasn't just a European thing. In 1830, the the Brazilians decide that they want to have stronger control over their own country and force Dom Pedro I to flee Belgium. So you remember Pedro came into power. He was the son of the Portuguese king and declared Brazil independent. I said Belgium, I meant Brazil. Declared Brazil independent. However, the Brazilians are like, look, you're too Portuguese. We are Brazilian. We want you out. And so he is forced to abdicate. And his son, Pedro II, is kept under the control of the Brazilian government until he can now rule on his own. Next, we have the Swiss in something called the Ostertag, where the Swiss, who had been under influence of France, are starting to demand their own constitution. So we see Swiss independence starting to emerge. And last but not least, we go back to France. So there are two different rebellions in the 1830s, in July of 1830 and in June of 1832. So the first one happens when the French King Charles X tries to return to an absolute monarchy. In July of 1830, rebellions rise up against him and he is overthrown and forced to abdicate. His cousin Louis Philippe is put on the throne with the promise that he was going to have a more limited monarchy. However, when he comes on the throne, many felt like he was favoring the wealthy. There were some economic hardships, poverty, unemployment, limited political reform that had been promised. And so students and Republicans in Paris, after the funeral of a popular general called General Lamarck, when he dies, students and workers build barricades in Paris and lead an armed uprising against the government. However, it is very quickly crushed. And throughout the rest of the 1830s, there's going to be continuing unrest in Paris and France. This is also the rebellion that Les Mis is based on. So there you go. Now we move on to 1848, and this is called the Springtime of the People. So this is the year of revolutions. And of course, we start back in France. So after years of dissatisfaction with Louis Philippe, again, he's been on the throne now for 18 years. The French, while they had a constitutional monarchy, voting rights are limited to the wealthy elites, and economic hardships in the 1840s hit the working classes pretty hard. So reformers decide that they are going to push for voting rights. There are protests in Paris that escalate into riots. The king abdicates and flees the country, and a republic is declared known as the Second Republic. So this republic is one of those moments where democratic ideals really collide with political realities. Like this begins with huge optimism. However, the republic collapses just a few years later in 1852. The idea was to replace the monarchy, and it just didn't work. Instead, what happens in 1848, France holds a presidential election. The nephew of Napoleon comes to the throne. And by 1852, Louis Napoleon declares himself emperor. So the republic failed. This is huge, right? Next, we have Germany. So in Germany, it is not a unified country. It's a collection of about 39 states into what's known as the German Confederation. Many Germans, especially the middle class, want national unity and a constitution. Industrialization was beginning, and these middle class people that came out of industrialization are demanding political power. So in 1848, they gather at what's called the Frankfurt Assembly, which met to create a unified German nation with a constitution. However, while the idea was there was a lot of debate about should there be a monarch? Should it be a president? Should Austria be included or should we leave them out? And because they could not get their act together and create this unified German nation, and because they could not agree on what was known as Big Germany versus Small Germany, include Austria or not include Austria, it really ultimately ends up failing. The assembly dissolves a year later. Many of the liberal leaders have to flee the country or are arrested, and German unification does not happen through liberal democracy. Next, we have Italy. So in Italy, again, Italy is divided into multiple states. Many are under foreign rule, including Austria. Northern Italy is mostly under the control of Austria. And in 1848, revolts break out in northern Italy, in Milan and Venice. And as this happens, some Italian states start to expel the rulers and leads to war against Austria. However, Austria's military is stronger. They regain control. However, it is going to lead to revolts later on. So while they couldn't agree or unify on what was going to happen in 1848, they will come to an agreement a little bit later. Next, we have the Austrian Empire. So the Austrian Empire is huge. And in 1848, the biggest movement happened in Bohemia and Hungary. So Hungary was a part of the Austrian Empire, but they had a very strong national identity. The Hungarians resented Austrian domination, and they wanted liberal reforms like freedom of the press and equality before the law. So a new Hungarian government is formed, and they declare autonomy. However, Austria regroups, gets help from Russia, and the Russians crush the Hungarian army. But it does demonstrate that Hungary is kind of chomping at the bit for independence. The next is Bohemia, and Bohemia is culturally Czech. So the Czech nationalism was founded on preserving language and culture, and really the Czechs wanted autonomy within the empire, not full independence. However, in 1848, they gather in Prague, and this is what's known as the Prague Uprising. And while it is suppressed by Austrian forces, it does help strengthen Czech identity and future nationalist movements. So throughout the rest of 1848, there are ethnic revolts all over the Austrian Empire in Vienna. Most of them are failures, but what they do show is a weakening empire. And while the Austrians are able to use their army and foreign help to crush these revolts, nationalism is going to continue to challenge Austria for the next 50 years or so. So these revolutions are known as the liberal revolutions. They end the old conservative order's sense of security and plant seeds for later nation building. And they really show that mass political movements can challenge these empires even when they fail. This also leads to the beginning of the breakup of many of these multi-ethnic empires. So starting with Austria, the Austrian Empire controls many people groups. You look at this map here, you can see all of the different ethnicities: Hungarians, Germans, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Poles, Serbs, Italian, and they all want self-determination. When Prussia unifies in the 1860s, they exclude Austria, and Austria realizes that they are losing leadership in the German world. And so in 1867, they have a compromise. So Hungary was the biggest one that was really pushing for their own self-determination. So in 1867, they come up with what's called the dual monarchy. So the empire is split into two parts, Austria and Hungary. They will both be ruled by one emperor, but he is also the king of Austria and the king of Hungary. So he's both, right? Now, what this does is the Austrians or the Hungarians gain political power, and that's what they wanted. They both had their own parliament and laws. They Both have their own cultural traditions. They do share some control of the military and foreign policy. But what ultimately is going to increase tensions rather than decreasing them, because some of the other ethnic groups are like, wait a minute, why can't we get this too? Right? Next, we have the Ottomans. So the Ottoman Empire controls the Greeks, the Slavs, the Arabs, Bulgarians, Armenians, and many, many people are asking for independence. The Ottoman Empire had been around for almost 1,000 years, and at this point, they are known as the sick man of Europe because of their decline. So after the Greek independence movements, there are increasing revolts in other areas of the Balkans as nationalism is beginning to spread, and they attempt to do some reforms in order to modernize. These are called the Tanzimat reforms. And so they try to grant equal citizenship. They try to modernize and unify the people. However, what this ultimately does is face backlash from conservative Turks who oppose these reforms and feared the loss of Islamic tradition and political authority. So we have now an internal division between the reformers and the nationalists. This is ultimately going to lead to something known as the Armenian Genocide, which is mass violence against the Armenian people group who had pushed for more rights and autonomies, and leading to a state-sponsored violence that is tied to nationalism. Ultimately, because of internal division and instability and increasing European interference, the Ottoman Empire is going to collapse after World War I. Last but not least, we have the Russians. So the Russians are in control of also quite a few ethnic groups, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the Estonians, among many others, and they are vast and diverse. They control so many groups that are trying to break away from Russia. At the end of the 1800s, the Russia lose a war known as the Crimean War to the Ottomans and their allies, and exposed Russia as militarily and technologically backward, damaging the authority of the Tsar. Now, as a result, they try to unify the empire under something called Russification. They want to impose Russian culture and try to unify by forcing Russian language, Russian culture, Russian religion. The problem is there's so many people groups who don't want to be part of this. So all this ends up doing is strengthening the nationalist feelings of all of the other people groups, angering those minority groups, and creating resistance to Russian rule. And this growing instability is ultimately going to lead to protests and revolts throughout Russia and weakening loyalty to the Tsar. So we see some of these places unite, some of them break away. And that's what's important about these empires. So what we'll see next is how empires can unify. I'll talk to you then. So while we have seen nationalism break up some empires, we are also going to now see how it can unify. And we're going to start in Italy. So Italy is not a country. It is a patchwork of states. Northern Italy is controlled by Austria. Central Italy is controlled by the Pope. Southern Italy is something called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And so they have their own kingdom. But Italy shares a cultural history and identity. The Roman Empire, the Renaissance. So even though they had no political unity, they still had cultural unity. After the Congress of Vienna, Austria becomes the dominant power in Italy, and many of them are beginning to really resent foreign control. So Italy is the perfect example of a strong national identity and weak political unity. So the unification of Italy is something known in Italian as risorgimento. Risorgimento means revival or rising again. And so it's this idea that you're going to unite and revive the Italian culture. And that primarily happens under three men. So we start with Giuseppe Mazzini. So Giuseppe Mazzini is born in 1805 in Genoa in northern Italy, and he wanted a unified, independent Italy, believing Italy should be democratic and republican. Strong believer in nationalism and liberalism. Believed that the ordinary people should drive change, not kings. And he, as a result, forms what's called Young Italy, which is a secret society promoting, or that is founded by nationalist youth promoting unity and revolution, and sponsors uprisings across Italy in the 1830s and 40s, spreading nationalist ideas through writings and speeches. So he is one of the ones that's leading one of the 1848 rebellions. So rebellions broke out, and actually he successfully leads a republic in Rome for a very short time. However, the result ultimately fails. He is driven into exile because he lacked military power and widespread support. But he is known as the ideological leader of the unification movement, right? He inspires future leaders and movements across Italy. He inspired the dream, even though he couldn't achieve it, right? But next, we have Camillo di Cavour. So he is the prime minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, which is an Italian state. He is wealthy, he is educated, he is politically skilled, he is more conservative. Now, he works as prime minister, he works in order to expand the borders of Sardinia, unifying most of northern Italy. And he wants to unify under a monarchy. He believes in gradual change in diplomacy over revolution. He believes in something called realpolitik, which we're going to talk about in a second, practical politics, not idealism. So he modernizes the Piedmont through industry, forms alliances with nations like France, and even leads a victory against Austria, helping expand the Piedmont's control. He used diplomacy and war to outmaneuver stronger powers. And he is able to do this with very practical, achievable goals in order to unify northern Italy. But it's just in the north. In the south, we have a guy named Giuseppe Garibaldi. So he is a revolutionary leader that is famous in the southern states of Italy. And he again supports Italian unity, initially supporting more Republican ideals, but he's more willing to compromise, right? He's not a radical, he is more of a liberal. So he led a volunteer army known as the Red Shirts. And this volunteer army invades southern Italy and quickly defeats the ruling monarchy in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and gains control of southern Italy. Now, he ends up being supported by Cavour. And this is important because even though they have different ideas about how they're going to do things, they have the same goal, which is unification. And because Giuseppe is willing to compromise, he says the only way we can unify is by working together. So he decides that he is going to turn over control of southern Italy to the king of Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel II, who was the king that Cavour worked for. And this is huge because he chooses unity over personal power and even over Republican ideals. So Italy is unified, but they're unified as a monarchy, which is different from what some of these other more liberal revolutions were. Garibaldi is often called the sword of unification because he provides the military force that is needed in order to complete unification. But again, Italy is unified as a monarchy, which is, again, not what these liberal revolutions were generally about. So I love this political cartoon because it's about the unification of Italy, and it shows how Italy is finally put together as a single nation. So what you see there is Garibaldi on the floor putting the boot on Victor Emmanuel II, the boot obviously being Italy. And so we see Garibaldi helping the king put on the final piece of the boot, right? He's handing over the territories, and the caption, "right leg in the boot at last," is a joke that means that Italy is finally complete and unified. There's also the quote on there, "If it won't go on, sire, try a little bit more powder," meaning gunpowder, suggesting that unification is achieved through war and revolution, not peacefully. So that's Italy. Moving on to Germany. German unification is led by one of my favorite historical figures, Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck is the Prime Minister of Prussia under Wilhelm I, and he is appointed in 1862. He is part of the Junker class. He is a Prussian aristocrat and land-owning elite, and he is a strong monarchist, and he is loyal to Wilhelm I, the Emperor of Germany, or Prussia. And he believed in something called realpolitik, politics of reality, that practicality is better than idealism. Enlightenment ideas are all well and good, but they're never going to work in reality. He believed that you could only expand through war. And he encourages the expansion of Russia this way. And he is famous for saying this quote: "The great questions of the day will not be settled by speeches or by majority decisions, not by popular sovereignty, but by blood and iron, military power and industry. They're not going to be unified by things like the Frankfurt Assembly. That did not work. Liberal debates are not going to happen. Instead, they're going to be unified through strong leadership." So the main thing he wants to do is strengthen the monarchy, not make it a democracy. He wants to exclude Austria from German affairs and unify the German states under Prussian leadership. He doesn't really care about nationalism as an idea. He cares about it as a tool. Whatever works to achieve the goal, that's realpolitik, right? So the first thing he's got to get over is Austria. So there had been tension between Prussia and Austria for centuries. So his goal is to isolate Austria diplomatically, and he wants to do this by going to war. So this is known as the Austro-Prussian War, also known as the 7 Weeks' War. That's a very fast war. So the key here is that Prussia has superior military training and equipment, and they are able to basically blitzkrieg, move very quickly through Austria in order to take them down. They are able to humiliate Austria at the end of this conflict. The modern army that they have is just decisively defeating them, and Austria is humiliated. This is the end of the German Confederation. Austria is excluded from German affairs, and territory that was Austrian is turned over to Prussia. And now Prussia is going to be the ones that are going to lead Germany. Prussia becomes the dominant German power, and this is a major step towards unification. However, it can't be the last step, because there are still some southern Germans who are unsure of Prussian control. So Bismarck, being the kind of guy that he is, knows that he needs a common enemy to unite all of Germany together. And so, who do the Germans hate? Well, the French. So he provokes the French. He insults the French with a diplomatic message called the Ems Dispatch. And France declares war on Prussia. So he made them the aggressors. They're the ones that declare war. So when France declares war on Prussia, Prussia's like, well, great, we got to get Germany together. Look what they've insulted us. And so the German states unite against France. The Prussians overwhelm them because they have a superior military. They overwhelm Paris, capture the Emperor Napoleon III, and force his surrender. And as a result, everyone is proud to be German. So the southern Germans accept Prussian control. And this is the moment that King Wilhelm of Prussia is crowned Kaiser, or Emperor, of Germany. And at the end of this war, in 1871, the German unified empire is proclaimed in the Palace of Versailles as a further insult to France. France is forced to give up some territory, namely Alsace-Lorraine, and creates huge resentment between France and Germany. So when you look at this map here, this just shows you the areas that are conquered and won over, the southern German states, the German Confederation, Austria-Hungary, all of those places. And when you look at this picture, so this is a painting of the coronation of Kaiser Wilhelm I, and I want you to notice a couple things. So this is Kaiser Wilhelm, right? But I kind of think he blends in with everybody else. My eyes are not drawn to Kaiser Wilhelm. They're drawn to this guy right here. And this is Bismarck. He is the real center of attention. Bismarck is the one who did this, not Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm's a puppet, right? And again, this is in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. They crown the German emperor in the French palace. French is not just defeated, they are humiliated. And that's exactly what Bismarck wanted, right? Bismarck does not care about nationalism. He wants to increase the power of Germany, right? So this political cartoon you can kind of see here is about the rise of Prussia and its dominance in Germany. Bismarck is the guy on the right in the blue, and he is shown as strong and in control, symbolizing Prussia's leadership. The smaller figure in red represents the other German states, and as you can see, he is kind of pulling them along, right? He's forcefully dragging the other German states into unification, kind of suggesting that German unity wasn't entirely voluntary. It was just driven by Prussian power and military strength. And Prussia really is the dominant force here. So, what happened to the balance of power? Think about what the Congress of Vienna was trying to do. They were trying to bring about this power of European monarchs in Europe and ultimately try to prevent things like these nationalist revolts. So, who became stronger? Who became weaker? How did nationalism affect all of these countries? And how did the balance of power shift by the end of these nationalist revolutions? So, keep that in mind, and we'll talk about it later. Hope this wraps up nationalism for you, and I'll see you in class. Bye.